Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Right Voices interview series, where we interview policymakers and policy experts on a wide range of energy, environmental, and climate issues. This week is Nuclear Science Week, and I'm pleased to be joined by an expert who knows more about nuclear energy and nuclear policy than anyone I know, Katie Tubb. Katie's a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation and writes on a wide range of energy and environment issues. And really, has spent a great deal of time researching, writing, and testifying on nuclear policy. So Katie, welcome to Right Voices.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
We're grateful to have you. So just to get started, I'm curious, how did you get into nuclear policy and what do you like about it?
That's a great question. And I think it tells you that pretty much anything is possible in Washington, D.C. So I started as an intern at Heritage and got kind of exposed to these energy and environment issues just in general. And just over time started gravitating towards nuclear energy. And that a lot of that has to do with Jack Spencer, who is vice president of our Economic Institute at Heritage. And his passion rubbed off on me. And, 10 years later, I'm still working on it. I think one of the things I love about the issue is you said I was one of the smartest people on nuclear energy that you've ever talked to. And I feel like one of the dumbest people in nuclear energy. I think I love that because one of the cool things about nuclear is I get to talk with people who are incredibly smart, who have dedicated years and years of education to the technology or aspects of the technology of aspects of the field like radiation. And I get to try and understand their world and then translate it to normal Americans who don't necessarily run up against these kinds of issues every day. So I love that kind of nexus of the education of normal Americans who like to think about, new ideas and translate that from the very technical side of things and be that bridge. So that's what I aspire to do. I don't know that I always do successfully, but I think that's one reason I love this issue area.
No, I think you do, and I think it brings a lot of credibility to your work with the humility in which you approach your work, and you're leaning on experts within their specific fields, because nuclear energy policy, covers such a wide range of issues, everything from small modular reactors to spent fuel to radiation, and so there's just so much to do and write on, and I think you kind of comprehensively cover it all. And you're kind of a unique bird in Washington, D.C. in that I would classify you as pro-nuclear but pro-free market. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And you're right that that's an odd place to be in D.C. So some days I have no friends and then other days I have a lot. And it just depends on the issue area. But it's that commitment to free markets and consumer choice that I think is so important to the success of the industry in the future. Because if, I think nuclear technology has so much to offer for affordable, reliable, innovative energy. But if they can't make a compelling case to the consumer, there's a problem there. And so that's what I love to do with nuclear energy policy, is to shine a light on some of those issues that create problems for the industry unnecessarily. So for example, safety regulations that pretty much have nothing to do with safety and everything to do with increasing regulatory burdens. I like to shine a light on that because it shows where we're hampering competition, hampering the industry. But I also want to uphold what I think is a very much a founding principle of why America has been a successful country for literally centuries at this point. And it's the creative tension caused by competition. And I think if we shelter the industry, not only are we harming the industry for the long haul, but we're putting burdens on customers that have choices. I think that's patently unfair, but also unproductive posture towards nuclear policy. So that's the tension I'm constantly wrestling with, and it creates a very interesting place in DC to play in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think putting the consumer front and center is often lost in conversations around Washington, D.C. We often talk about what the industry needs or what the industry wants, whether it's nuclear or otherwise, without thinking necessarily about the taxpayer or the consumer. And that affects so many businesses and households across the United States. So I want to get into some specific policies, but before we do that, curious, just for folks who don't follow nuclear all that closely, how would you describe the state of nuclear energy in the United States right now?
Oh boy, that's kind of the money question. I have a very mixed bag. I have reasons to be encouraged, reasons to feel like we're kind of where we've been for the last 30 years and haven't made progress. So there's basically in the United States, we have one predominant technology, large light water reactors. And in the last decade, especially, we have a lot of new advanced technologies that are looking at how to change the size, what kind of waste they produce, what kind of fuel they use. So a lot of innovation happening in the field, but these technologies are running up against a regulatory structure that's been around for decades and is not, it's very prescriptive and designed for the old technology. And there's nothing wrong with the old technology. The problem is these regulatory structures make it very hard to innovate in the United States and get new technology out there. And I think that's how you have a healthy, productive, growing industry, is the ability to innovate. And so I think that's kind of where we are right now. I see signs of hope that is changing, but I also see signs of unwillingness to address some of the underlying regulatory issues. Kind of some big baskets of reform that I think still need to happen. Our nuclear waste management policy, I think it's a very solvable problem, but we've made a political jungle gym disaster around how to deal with that issue. And I think that's critical for the industry to move forward. Kind of a second basket of issues is how we deal with radiation, which is kind of an underlying piece to so many aspects of regulation. And then a third basket is this tension between non-proliferation desires and commercial civilian nuclear exports, and then just kind of the broader global perspective and realities of where civilian nuclear industry is globally and where our non-proliferation tensions are. And that has implications for things like exports, how we get US technology out into countries that are interested in nuclear energy. So I think those are kind of the three big baskets of where I still see a lot of room for improvement. There are definitely people out there talking about that kind of stuff, but I don't see a lot of impetus or gumption amongst Congress and regulators to start changing some of those things. So long way of saying, I think there's a lot of things to be encouraged about, but I think there's still quite a bit of work to do.
Yeah, so let's touch on all of those, because I think those are interesting buckets. And you've spent a lot of time researching in all three of those buckets. So let's start from the first one you talked about, which is kind of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, small modular reactors. There's a lot of interesting, innovative companies that are out there that are trying to get these small modular reactors off the ground. So where is the Regulatory Commission at in trying to help get some of those reactors licensed and permitted? And what do you think needs to be done to kind of move that along even more efficiently and more expeditiously?
Yeah, so there's so many directions we could go in this. So there's two advanced reactors that are currently going through licensing at the NRC, which I think is really exciting. There's roughly 7 advanced reactors. Again, these are the new innovative technologies that are going through pre-licensing activities at the NRC. So there's a lot going on. And I think some of that I would say a lot of that has to do with the industry pushing change and forcing the question. I think there have been some really useful tools that came out of Congress and the DOE that helped that along. One that I really like is the GAIN voucher program at the Department of Energy, which basically offers vouchers to anybody in the industry. Of course, they have to build the case and compete for it. But it gives them access to the Department of Energy to test some of these concepts. And the reason I like that is because the voucher goes to the national lab, and the industry has to foot the bill for their own work. And I like that because it pulls away any kind of cronyism that I think some of the more common tools coming out of Congress and the DOE are subject to, and that's, direct grants to a specific energy company. And I don't think that solves another problem, and it's access to the national labs. So I love this GAIN voucher program because I think it effectively gives access to the national labs without that cronyism angle in there that I think, again, harms the industry long term. So all is to say, a lot of activity with the NRC. Another big activity at the NRC is this Part 53 regulatory exercise. So Congress in the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act directed the NRC to develop technology neutral, risk-informed, performance-based regulations. Again, thinking of these advanced reactors in mind. And the point there was to force the NRC to update their regulations so that they were goal-oriented. Here's the objective we want you industry to meet. Show us how you get there, which is much more of the Canadian model, as opposed to the regulations we have now, which are very prescriptive. Jump through these hoops and then we'll give you a license. And that's, again, problematic for reactors that don't even have those hoops. Relevant. So I guess that's kind of going again with the theme I brought up earlier, that there's reasons to be excited, there's reasons to be discouraged. But I think there's a lot of activity in the NRC that I hope will bear fruit in the next 2 to 4 years that will have implications longer term for the industry to innovate. I guess just one other area where I'm seeing encouraging growth at the NRC to respond to these changes in the nuclear industry is they're currently undergoing a review of their environmental principles and policies for implementing the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a big piece of the regulatory review process. And I'm really encouraged to see the NRC start to look at that again and consider reforms that are more in line with this performance-based, risk-informed approach. So we'll see how that plays out. But just the fact that they are opening the question, basically for the first time since 1984, is very encouraging to me. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer to your question about what's going on in the advanced reactor world, but
no, that was really helpful. Yeah, no, I think that was good because, especially at least someone who's looked at this a little bit, it seems as if, as you mentioned, the large light water reactors all kind of had to go through this specific licensing and permitting requirement, but they were all largely the same technology. So it wasn't really something the NRC had to worry about as much. But with all of these SMR technologies, you're using different fuels, they're different technologies, and so you don't want to funnel an NRC licensing and permitting process that benefits one specific technology at the expense of others, or have them, as you mentioned, jump through regulatory hoops that they're not even supposed to be jumping through. So to have some safety requirements and environmental performance standards that meet certain standards and metrics seems to be a lot more pragmatic than super specific technology performance standards. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, you said in fewer words exactly what I'm trying to get. I think it's important also to note, Nick, that is good for safety. That's good for environmental reviews, because the more we flood the system with irrelevant information, the less both industry and the regulator have capacity to focus on what are the actual safety and environmental concerns that need to be addressed. And so I think a more efficient regulatory system that focuses on objectives rather than prescriptive hoops that may or may or may not be relevant helps us get to our objective, which is what all Americans want, is safe and safe for both people and the environment, power plants, whether that's nuclear or else otherwise. So I think it gets us closer to what we actually want.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And speaking of safety, one of the things you brought up was radiation. And I think that's a word that obviously scares a lot of people, especially if you watch Chernobyl on HBO and see what radiation might do to people. What's the issue with radiation standards through the Environmental Protection Agency, through international standards? And can you just give our audience an overview as to why this area is so important, and why it's important to regulate radiation in a way that protects public health and safety, but also does it in a way that doesn't stifle innovation in the industry?
Yeah, so radiation makes really good movies and TV programs, but it's not as scary as you think. And I think, if anyone wants to learn more about radiation, the different kinds of radiation, how it interacts with, nuclear power plants, the NRC has some really good resources out there. One is just radiation in our daily lives. So we don't tend to think about it, but we're exposed to radiation every single day just by living on planet Earth. And if you live in Colorado or anywhere near the mountains, you're exposed to even more radiation. So radiation is just a part of our everyday lives. Every time you eat a potato chip or get a dental x-ray, you're exposed to radiation. So I think part of the education process is just understanding that radiation is a fundamental and sometimes very essential part of everyday living. Unfortunately, I think a lot of our regulatory philosophies around radiation are responses to fear. And while that may have been justifiable early on, as we were really just learning about radiation and the effects of radiation, especially at lower levels, low doses, I don't think that's appropriate now. We've learned so much since the 1950s, let alone the 1970s. And just to give you an example of this, the one major nuclear power accident in the United States was at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979. And no one died from that. No one had serious or mild health effects from radiation. And to me, that is a huge advertisement for the nuclear industry, because you have the worst power plant accident in the United States, and no one was harmed by it. And so to me, that's how we need to be thinking about radiation is, okay, what are the thresholds for actual health and safety concerns? And what is just a response out of fear? And also, I think that is a huge reason why both our regulators and our politicians need to be well versed on this, because we depend on them to give us good information. Regulating out of fear, I think, does not serve the American public. And unfortunately, philosophies like the linear no threshold model, or the as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA, these philosophies where basically the underlying principle is there is no level of radiation that is safe, those underlie so many of our regulations now. And the consequence for that is not only misinforming the public, but it increases costs and complexity in our regulations, which has implications in for the technology that we build. And so that's one of those issues that I think we really need to start focusing in on and have courage to change, because we've learned so much, both in the United States, but globally, around this issue of radiation exposure. It's not easy.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think it requires courage, and that's why we elect leaders to make changes that require courage, and this is one of those areas where I think change is very necessary.
Yeah, and just briefly, can you explain what the linear no threshold model looks like?
Yeah, so it impacts radiation exposure standards, but it's also just a general philosophy that exposure to X chemical or, radiation or whatever, always has risk. So if you bring it down to 0, that's the only acceptable amount of exposure. And that's just not consistent with reality, at least when it comes to radiation. I think there's some really good work that has been done under the Department of Energy to kind of figure out where a threshold might be, or a range of a threshold. And I think there's a lot of really good work internationally to get closer to a more realistic model of radiation exposure. But LNT is a philosophy we've been working under for decades at this point. And so it's very entrenched in certain parts of academia, but also our regulatory structure.
Yeah. Speaking of the international side, that's something that you brought up, as well as both, I think, challenges and opportunities. And people look to France and people say, oh, well, France went 80% nuclear. Maybe that's what the US should do, or the rest of the world should do. So is there a country that gets it right when it comes to nuclear that you think the US could model, whether it be France or elsewhere, or why not to be like France? And secondly, what does this mean in the context of global climate change? I think one of the criticisms, and rightly so, of the Biden administration's approach to climate policy and having a net zero emissions goal by 2050 is that it's so unilaterally focused, and therefore it really won't make that much of a dent in abating global emissions, and therefore global temperatures and sea level rise and things like that. So if you are concerned about that, what does the international landscape need to look like for nuclear policy?
Your first question first. So I think, there's still a lot of good things we do here in the United States, so I don't want to totally rag on the nuclear landscape in the United States. But I think if I were to look to other countries to improve aspects of how we do things, I like the Canadian model for regulation. And to that end, over the past couple of years, the Canadian regulator and the US regulator, the NRC, have been collaborating, especially on this question of how to approach advanced reactors. So I think there's encouraging collaboration there. We'll see what kind of fruit comes out of it. But, I like the Canadian model for regulation. Finland, I like how they do nuclear waste management and management policy. They have a very clear delineation between the responsibilities of the industry and of the state. And it's producing results, unlike here in the United States, where we're at a total stalemate. France is interesting in that I like how they have addressed the issue of spent fuel and reusing that and having an option to reuse it. Whereas in the United States, we shut down that conversation in the 70s and 80s. And I think we're still seeing some of the consequences of that today. So I would love to pick and choose from different countries and pull the best from them to incorporate here in the US. As far as global warming and what role nuclear can contribute to that, no matter what you think about that issue, I think nuclear energy offers compelling answers. And, if you're concerned about global emissions, then you should be concerned about global emissions and have less concern about what's going on in the US. So what I mean by that is emissions are being driven by the developing world. In some ways, that's a really good thing because energy poverty is a real problem. We don't suffer with that in the United States, most of us, and that's something we take for granted. And that's really nice to be able to take for granted. But in parts of the world where that's more of a challenge, I think nuclear can offer some solutions because not only is it energy dense and it's around for decades, it also has no emissions, whether we're talking about traditional air pollutants or we're talking about greenhouse gases. And so that issue of trade that I mentioned earlier and that tension between nonproliferation and civilian commercial nuclear is a challenge if you want to get American nuclear technology out the doors. An example of that is in recent history is just the challenges we faced with establishing a 1-2-3 agreement, which is the agreement between the United States and a partner country to just open the door for civilian nuclear trade. It sets the conditions for here's how you can use our technology, here's how you can't use our technology, and here are the consequences if you divert it to non-peaceful uses. So it sets the basic ground rules. That became that agreement, that 1-2-3 agreement, became a huge issue with the Saudi Arabians, who are trying to build a civilian nuclear energy industry. And basically, it's just fizzled out between the United States and Saudi Arabia to establish this 1-2-3 agreement, which to me is a huge missed opportunity to come into a country at the ground level and help them build not just nuclear reactors, but the safety culture around how to operate and regulate nuclear power plants. And that relationship is just stuck at this point because we can't get over the finish line on a 1-2-3 agreement. And it's not just with Saudi Arabia. These 1-2-3 agreements have become very political. And I think it's really unfortunate. So to me, that's a huge opportunity for growth if you're interested in getting nuclear technology out the doors to the rest of the world.
Yeah. 2 follow-ups there. Why did the 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia fizzle out, and why have they become so political?
That's a huge question. I think I will simplify it by saying it's this tension with non-proliferation desires, which are good, and wanting civilian commercial technology, which does not produce bombs, but the implication or the possibility in some people's minds to create bombs. We have all kinds of non-proliferation tools, 1-2-3 agreements being one of them, but certainly not the only one, to help prevent diversion of civilian technology to non-peaceful ends. And I think there is a routine education problem in Congress. And also to see the technology. And so there's I think, a lack of appreciation for just how much competition is out there, both for civilian technology and the ability to access unpeaceful uses by building relationships with countries that have less pure goals in mind, perhaps. And so I think it's just this constant education issue to understand the global reality of nuclear technology, both civilian and otherwise. And it's that constant tension, which is not just at the congressional level, but also in the bureaucratic level. You can slow walk a lot of things. Proliferation, regulatory approvals and whatnot. We've talked a lot about the NRC, but nuclear energy is regulated not just by the NRC, but by the Department of Energy, the Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, and that creates a lot of opportunities to get the policy wrong, the big picture wrong. And I think that's part of what plays into these 1-2-3 agreements.
Thanks. That's a very good explanation of it all. And speaking of the need for constant education and also the ability to slow off things at a snail's pace, I want to get you out of here, but spent fuel and nuclear waste management have been emblematic of those issues as well. First, can you just tell us what is nuclear waste, what is spent nuclear fuel, and why has the US system of spent fuel management been broken down to a point where arguably nothing really has happened? You pointed to kind of a French model to at least have the ability of recycling, and you've talked about the Finns model working quite well, but what's the breakdown in US policy?
Talking about time management problems, we can talk about this for hours.
Yeah. That's why I saved it for last.
That was smart, strategic of you. So nuclear waste, I think, is more appropriately termed as spent nuclear fuel, at least when we're talking about the context of civilian nuclear power plants. When you put a fuel rod into a reactor, at some point it stops producing reactions efficiently, and so you pull it out, and there's still quite a bit of potential energy there that just needs to be reconcentrated. And so that's what the French do, is I'm using unscientific terms, but they essentially reconcentrate the fuel to then reuse. In the US, we don't do that for a variety of reasons. But I think a huge reason is the statutory framework, the policy around nuclear waste management. So in the US, the nuclear industry is responsible for paying for nuclear waste management, but the Department of Energy is responsible for basically everything else: the siting, construction, transportation to, operation of, and decommissioning of an actual repository. A repository is necessary no matter what kind of recycling you do or don't do. So at the end of the day, you are always going to need a repository. But that bifurcation of responsibilities, I think, creates all kinds of counterproductive incentive structures, in that I think we all know at this point that politicians are interested in reducing and minimizing political risk. And that incentive structure is not productive to getting towards what we need in a nuclear waste management policy, and that is a sustainable and confident policy that gets us to a repository. And so under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which is the big umbrella for nuclear waste management, we basically haven't made any progress towards a repository since at least 2010, which is the last time Congress appropriated fees from the nuclear industry to do anything about a repository. And I don't see any encouraging signs that we're getting anywhere closer to a solution. And I think that's where we could talk for hours about why that is, and where I think we need to go. But the short answer is, I think we need to move to a model like what is seen in Finland, where the nuclear industry is responsible for not just paying for nuclear waste management, but also siting, building, operating, and decommissioning a repository, because they have the incentive to do that effectively. They have the self-incentive, that's their problem to fix, but it also allows the government to be a referee instead of this kind of mixing of responsibilities. And so I think that has not just aligned incentive structures that get towards a solution, but I think it also allows the industry to do what it does well and has the knowledge to do well. And it allows the government to be the perceived and real protector of the public good and public health and safety, to oversee the activity of the industry. And those clearer lines and lanes, I think, get us much closer to actually solving this problem, which I see as much a problem right now as it is an opportunity. I think if we can fix nuclear waste management, we'll see all kinds of innovation, not just in how we manage waste, but throughout the fuel cycle, by which I mean the kinds of fuel plants use, the kinds of technologies we use, and then also what we do with the spent fuel.
Thanks. That's a great answer. And I think what I appreciate about you is your way to communicate both the policy with the technology in a way that's easily understandable for both policymakers, for congressional staff, for the general public. So really appreciate you taking the time to join us in and during Nuclear Science Week. Is there anything that I asked or that I didn't ask you that you wanted to touch on?
You really want to open that question up, Nick.
Yeah, make it an elevator pitch.
Right. I think I would just sum it up by saying there's a lot of reasons to be excited about what's happening in the nuclear industry and changes I see in nuclear regulation. There's still a lot of issues that require leadership and attention. And so, that tension is a great place to continue to work in and educate ourselves about. There's a lot of really smart people out there who are doing good work in specific issues in the bigger picture. So thank you for having me and joining me in the conversation. I think this is a really exciting space to play in and continue learning. And so, yeah, I think, we could talk for hours, which is a great place to end, A, to save everybody else time, but B, to invite people into the conversation for themselves.
Absolutely. Where can we check out your work?
Go to heritage.org. You can see my work if you just pull up my name, Katie Tubb. I've got a paper out from earlier this summer on what I think is effective nuclear energy policy. So if there's anything I said you would like to learn more about or you disagree with and want to grapple with more, check out that paper on effective nuclear energy policy. And then I'd also recommend some of the work of my colleagues who are more on the defense side of this. Patty Jane Geller is a really good analyst to be watching if you're interested in the kind of more non-proliferation and defense side of nuclear policy.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Katie, and thanks to all of you for joining us on Nuclear Science Week. Please check out the other interviews that we did throughout the week and check out the content that's on our Newsmag at C3 Newsmag, and be sure to stay tuned for our next interviews that we've got lined up. A lot of good policymakers, members of Congress. Our Tech Voices series has a lot of interesting companies who are doing a lot of innovative work in the energy, climate, and environment space. So please check back regularly to see all of what we got going